In this exercise, I'm going to demonstrate how to output printer marks along with your artwork. I've gone ahead and restored the saved version of TrappedBlacks.ai inside the 11 printing folder, complete with its printable media layer, incidentally. And now I'm going to press Control-P or Command-P in order to bring up the print dialog box, and I'm going to change the range value to 4. So that we can take a look at the fourth artboard. And this is the one that features the dynamic crop marks around the surfboard and the static crop marks around the skateboard. Now those indicate to my printer that I want them to trim the surfboard and skateboard independently from that page. However, something to note here. These crop marks are going to print only if they fall inside the bleed. And let me show you what I mean by that. I'll click the Done button in order to save those settings for a moment. And then I'll switch over to the Artboards panel, double-click on Skate and Surf. I'll marquee those surfboard elements there, and I'm going to drag the surfboard over to the right so that its far right crop marks just barely fall outside the red bleed boundary. Then I'll press Control-P or Command-P to redisplay the print dialog box, and now notice that we cannot see those right-hand crop marks because they fall outside the bleed. So nothing gets printed outside the bleed. It doesn't matter if it falls inside the imageable area of the page or not. If it's not inside the bleed, it doesn't print. If you want to enlarge that bleed from inside the print dialog box, you can. You switch to marks and bleed right there. And then you could turn off use document bleed settings. And that's going to go ahead and get rid of your bleed entirely. Notice that. Actually, I'll switch back to general so that we can see all of my pages and see what the difference is. Switch back to marks and bleeds again. Now notice that Illustrator is cropping my artwork tight to the artboard dimensions. And the artboard boundary, by the way, represents the trim size. Bear that in mind. All right, well, that's way too tight. So I'll take these bleed settings, let's say out to 48 point. And then I'll press the Tab key, and that'll update all of the bleed settings by default because they're linked together. You can unlink them, of course, if you like. All right, now I'll switch ahead to the fourth artboard right here. And notice now that I can see the crop marks because they fall inside of the bleed. So that's just something to bear in mind. You need to make sure that everything that's part of your artwork falls inside the bleed if you want to print it at all. Whether you're printing it to a commercial printer or a local printer, that is a printer in your home or office, doesn't matter. Everything's got to be in that bleed. All right, but you know what? Between you and me, it was before. So I'm going to cancel out of here, and I'm going to press Control-Z or Command-Z on a Mac to undo the movement of that surfboard. Its crop marks will get cut ever so slightly, as you can see here. In fact, they may not be acceptable. I may think, you know what? I don't want them clipped at all, so I'll go ahead and move that surfboard in. Bearing in mind, of course, that you don't want the crop mark from the skateboard to encroach on the trim size of the surfboard right there. So you've got to be careful. You also don't want this kind of confusion. You really don't want overlapping crop marks like this in a real job. So I'll scoot this guy over as much as I can and still keep 100% of those crop marks. All right, now I'll press Control-P once again or Command-P on the Mac to revisit my print dialog box. I'll go ahead and set the range back to all so that I can see all of my artboards, and I'll switch over to marks and bleeds. So you've got this option to override the bleed settings. That's one thing you can do inside this panel. Another thing you can do is turn on various printer marks. Now, I recommend whatever the job is, more likely than not, you're going to want to turn on all the printer marks. And all you do is turn on that checkbox and you're good to go. However, I'm going to walk you through these printer marks so you have a sense of how they work. The trim marks, and you're going to have to keep a very careful eye on this print preview. The trim marks are the crop marks for the artboard itself. So they indicate the trim size of the page. And you can see these tiny little crop marks right there. They can extend well outside of the bleed, incidentally. So anything that's actually part of your artwork has to fall inside the bleed. Anything that's added by the print dialog box can fall outside the bleed. And that's kind of the point. The area outside of the bleed is supposed to be the domain of the print dialog box exclusively so that it can add its printer marks without overlapping the artwork. Notice if these trim marks do overlap the artwork, they'll be inverted. So wherever they fall across dark regions of your artwork, you will get a white crop mark. Wherever they extend out into the page white zone, then you'll get black crop marks. Next, we've got the registration marks, which are useful for registering separations. That is your cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink separated onto different plates. We've got the color bars right along the sides, and at the bottom, we have a luminance bar there. And that helps to gauge the accuracy of your colors. And then finally, we've got page information, which is labeling information. It's going to tell you the document name, the artboard, and so on. Now, notice over here that we can set our print mark type from Western to Eastern, essentially. So that's entirely up to you. I'm going to leave that set to Roman. And then we have a trim mark weight. So you can change the weight of those crop marks that are assigned here inside the print dialog box. By default, they're a 1/4 point thick, which is essentially a hairline. If you think your printer can accommodate thinner lines, then you can go with 1/8 of a point. However, that may drop away, so you never know if something that thin is actually going to hold up. If you go with something thicker, like a 1/2 point here, then it's not always clear where you trim, because a 1/2 point is a fairly thick line to trim along. So do you trim along the top side of the line, the bottom side of the line? I generally recommend to eliminate any confusion and make sure the line prints that you stick with the default setting there. But I would change my offset value. Notice that this is the distance, by the way, between, for example, the edge of the color bars and the trim size, that is the artboard edge. And 6 points isn't very far. I typically recommend that offset value be at least the size of the bleed. So I'd raise it to 18 points, for example. And I might even take it higher than that. I might take it to 24 points in the case of this illustration. You just want to make sure that you don't go so high that the printer marks fall outside of the imageable area of the page. And ultimately, if you're handing this job off to a commercial printer, they're in charge of determining this information. But when you're trying to get a sense of how the document is going to output to your local printer, you might find these options useful. In the next exercise, I'm going to demonstrate the PostScript-only output options.